Hello, everyone.
Hello, Shane.
Hi there. Thank you for making it today. It's good to have you here.
Same here.
So, I'm just going to put up our antitrust policy notice as usual. So here we are, antitrust policy notice and everything. Today's meeting will be of a slightly different format to usual. What I want to do is basically talk about inclusiveness in the OpenChain community. And I think this is particularly important given recent developments around, for example, the Free Software Foundation and the reappointment of Richard Stallman to their board. Clearly, that was not an appropriate action, and it has garnered a fierce global pushback, as it rightly should. If there's one thing that's been clear in the open source community and the broader technical community at large, it's that inclusiveness has not always been effective. It has not always been up to the standard that we should expect it to be. And many aspects of this are gradually being improved. But we have a long way to go. I'm going to give some examples. The very fact that people could be reintroduced into a community after being provably problematic is, I don't think, we should generally tolerate. It's certainly not something that the OpenChain community tolerates. The same applies to the use of terminology that can be problematic. For example, recently we've had terminology such as slave and master replaced, as it should be, by primary and secondary. We've had terminology such as black and white lists replaced with approved and unapproved, and so on and so forth. This is all necessary as we evolve as communities. Now, specifically, OpenChain has tried to be at the forefront of being an inclusive community from the very beginning, as have all the other Linux Foundation projects. So, for example, as a general policy in Linux Foundation, if we're going to have a panel of experts, we don't accept panels where only males are proposed. The same type of thinking has permeated the OpenChain project since day one. And you can see that in various aspects of how we run our community. For example, we have, of course, our global community, and we have lots of lots of different kind of inclusive efforts, such as making sure that there's project availability and support in people's native language. We've also tried to ensure that as we introduce people to our global community, we're conscious of the necessity of ensuring visible diversity. The last thing we need is for people to have the impression that OpenChain is yet another community of middle-aged white males, because it isn't. We have a broad and diverse community in terms of both genders and cultures and races. But I'm curious about what we can do to do better in the year ahead. And in this sense, what I wanted to do with this webinar was to take a pause and to consider the positive and negative examples we've seen across the world and how we are trying to address them inside of OpenChain. Let me give you a very broad example. We have strategic advisors to the project. At the moment, we've got two strategic advisors. One is Katerina Maraki, and the other, hello, someone speaking?
Okay.
Well, I think it's just background noise. We've got two strategic advisors at the moment. One is Katerina Maraki and the other is Matthias Jue. And I'd like to talk about how we could potentially expand that senior advisor circle. and bring in some people from outside of Europe into that. I think we should do some representation in Asia, for example. We probably could do with some representation from both Middle Asia, such as India, and the Far East, such as China, Japan, or Korea. I think we also need to look at the diversity in our various project work teams. We have quite a few work teams, actually. Let me just pull up the actual list. So apart from our global webinars and our global work teams, and our global mailing lists, we also have work teams in Germany, India, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, UK, and we just launched our work team in the United States as well. I think what we could probably benefit is from having more people from our regional work teams helping to run our global work groups, such as automotive, tooling, education, specification, partner network. Right now, we do have some nice diversity. Education is run by Balakrishna from India, by way of example. Automotive is run by Endo-san from Japan. And I think that's a good trend. But I do think that it might be useful to increasingly decentralize our project. For example, at the moment, I am the de facto leader of both the main global community and our partner network. I think it might be worth decentralizing the chairing of the partner network, the partners' mailing list, into one of the local partners. Not to say I wouldn't be present on the calls and so on, but to increasingly hand the community into the hands of the community and avoid any single points of failure. The last thing we want is for one of us to, for example, get COVID, like myself, and to be unable to run the work groups and the things to grind to a halt. I think that's an important part of diversity as well, apart from the simple surface level. So I wanted to poll you on what you think would be useful for the OpenChain community. What can we do to increase diversity and inclusion? What can we do to also support other projects and activities around the world in this type of activity? Apart from what we currently do, and apart from having a clear stance that diversity and inclusion is a key part of this project, of the management of our ISO standard, and of the example we want to set to everyone else. So, pausing here, does anyone have suggestions for how we can increasingly support diversity and inclusion in gender, culture, race, and so on? Okay, if no one has concrete examples to share at this moment, and that's fine, I have a couple of suggestions and I would like your opinion on them. Firstly, I think looking at our general activities around the world, our local work groups are diverse, and that's great. I do think that our global work groups, like I said, I think we could do with having a little more diversity. For instance, the partners to have their own chair of their meetings. For example, in other areas that we potentially look at having rotating chairs of meetings to keep things fresh and exciting. And of course, when it comes to things like our regional lists, perhaps to explicitly include people as chairs for their local area. Let me give you an example. At the moment, I largely chair meetings in certain jurisdictions at the moment. So when it came to our Germany work group, I chaired the first meetings there. When it came to our US work group, I've chaired the first meetings there. I believe the sustainable model is more like what we have in Japan and Korea and India, where the local community chairs the activity themselves and takes ownership of it. The same issue, of course, arises when we talk about how we manage the truly global parts of our community. So let's take our bi-weekly webinars and our global work team calls. It's fairly natural that as the general manager of the project, that I tend to chair the global work team calls. But I do intend to introduce some diversity into the chairing of these calls. As well as myself in the OpenChain project, we also have Jenny helping as one of our project managers. So I'm thinking to split the global work team call chairing between myself and Jenny at the moment. For example, I will chair the first bi-weekly webinar of each month, like today, and I will chair the first global work team meeting, as we're having next week. But then we'll switch to Jenny chairing the second bi-weekly webinar and the second global work team meeting. And I think that might help freshen things up and also make sure not only are we gender diverse in chairing these meetings, but we don't have a single point of failure. By the same token, I wanted to talk about how we can make our bi-weekly webinars more inclusive. As of last month, we began to switch our webinar format. The first Monday webinar is a community-focused webinar, just like today where I'm discussing the future of the project. And in this case, I'm doing it very interactively. I'm giving everyone a chance to interject. And that makes sense. We're talking about the future of our project. The second webinar each month on the third Monday is going to be focused on practical presentations on, for example, tooling, and from our partners talking about their areas of domain experience, like intellectual property management or process management. So basically, we have one community webinar and one nitty-gritty details of something like tooling or process management. But that doesn't explain how we make the webinars more inclusive. And I think that's something we need to do. Right now, essentially, Jenny and I are scheduling out the community webinars, the first webinar of each month. But I'd like to share that with you. We're in a unique position that we can ask almost anyone to join our webinars, and they'll agree because we have a very visible global community. And it's a great opportunity to talk to it. So I don't think it's fair that I make a decision on what the content of our first Tuesday webinar is. I think you should have a substantial amount of input into that. What community figures do we contact? Who do we bring to give us strategic leadership? And that's an area of immediate improvement for the project. I don't think we've had enough of that, not yet. And I certainly think we can do it. Let me give you some examples. We may want to have a list of proposed webinars, and that builds up a corpus of examples that people want. Some people might want to hear from, for example, Deb, the executive director over at OSI, to see what they're doing strategically. Some people might want to hear about what Greg KH is doing around the Linux kernel. Some people may want something completely different. Going back into governance, well, if a project such as the To-Do group is doing some interesting work about OSPOs, maybe we want some of their project management or their key community leaders to speak. And that should partially, at least, be your decision too. I wanted to pause there actually and ask a question. Are there any community figures, any community organizations you'd like to hear from in the OpenChain community? Don't worry if you don't have any ideas right now. We can discuss this in more detail later.
Shane, we just mentioned FSF. I don't know if we would like to get their point of view as well.
Uh, you know what? I think they blew it so badly there.
Yeah.
That
Just, came to my mind.
well, it's a fair comment. It's a fair
Yeah.
comment. Yeah. Personally, I think that they went so far inappropriate that giving them a platform to justify it, I would be concerned about. But in principle, I just want to say that I think you make a valuable point that we should always listen to people. I just think they blew it so badly that attempting to justify it now, I wouldn't want them to give them a platform for that.
Yeah.
I'd suggest that if they have a good justification, put it on their website. And if that justification was so incredible that it made all the organizations that rejected them reconsider their position, then it would be something I'd say, well, that's something we didn't think of. But they haven't done anything remotely like that. They've just lost their senior staff and been roundly rejected while also digging in and not fixing the damage they've done. But that, I mean, that's a personal take on my side, and it's also based on the furious community response to their action. But in principle, I think that as a project, we're always open to listening to people. It's just that we have to have a cutoff point where it's like, yeah, we don't want to give a platform to that.
Yeah, just like, this is not court, but normally in court, both sides get, to represent themselves. Yes.
And generally, I'd say, we're not the appropriate place for political discourse on this project because we don't want to get stuck in two sides fighting. We want to make sure that we're trying to inspire the community and leadership around it. So that means, actions against inclusion are off the table. But when it comes to more generalized politics, I think that we want to steer clear of that because we want this to be clear-cut. We're compliance, and we also give a platform to strategic vision. But I don't think we should give a platform to political fighting. I think there's other platforms for that, where people can go and sort it out. And once they've sorted out their fighting, we can come back and talk strategic guidance.
Shane, if I may, I agree with you. I think one of the strong assets of OpenChain is being neutral and not taking part in disputes that can have a negative effect on the general and global OpenChain community.
That's a good point. I suppose one of the fundamental things is that OpenChain is by and large about how companies address process management and compliance. That's basically what we do. So a lot of virtually all of the politics around the world is irrelevant to us. We just don't care. It's not what we're doing. And where there is something that could strategically inform us, let's just say we hear from OSI that they're updating the open source definition, something like that. That's not about endorsing OSI as a political organization. It's about addressing the fact that we use the open source definition, and that strategic activity with a change would be really good to know ahead of time, by way of example. But for people to promote a particular goal, a political goal, let's say looking for a platform to promote the politics of free software, or looking for a platform to justify political actions, I think that's outside our remit. I think that's a case of go do it on someone's political podcast or something like that. When I say it'd be great if we can have community talks and community vision, what I mean is I want us to have the pulse of where we have billions of dollars of development going. But I certainly don't want us to become involved in the politics of this stuff, because our community is just not involved in that. It's not relevant to them. Apart from when something big happened, like the FSF blow up had companies like Red Hat immediately take a very strong stance. And I think that's understandable because we're dealing with serious gender politics. And it's something like that whole thing is toxic. We don't want that near us. Yeah. Though of course the nuance and the judgment calls will always be there. I just noticed Nicole is unmuted. Did you want to jump in, Nicole?
Yeah, I'm saying, hi everybody. What I've been thinking now with all this discussion, it's maybe we should find a strategy how to not mess up our integrity as the OpenChain project on the long term. You know, as I say, my viewpoint is I'm living here in my white German automotive bubble. And sometimes things just come into me, like, you know, this with this master slave discussion in naming subsystems or software parts. It would have never came to my mind that that's problematic, but I took this information. I said, okay, in future things need to be named different because I don't want to you know, I don't want anybody to feel bad about what I'm doing. So maybe it's more like a kind of change management process or issue management, or how do we bring in problematic stuff and maybe discuss this or reconsider what we've been doing if we are affected by something that we have not thought about before.
That's an interesting point. And I came across an example of this about 2 weeks ago. So in the British Isles, it's a fairly common, or previously was a fairly common usage, that when someone was acting outside the boundaries of what you expected, the terminology used was off the reservation. And the terminology definition, it wasn't in the Cambridge or Oxford dictionary, one of them, just use that business definition. Yet in the United States, it's a very sensitive term because it referred to the Native Americans being restricted to reservations in the United States. And that's the actual origin of the term. So it's quite an offensive term in the United States, yet even the dictionary didn't mention it as an offensive term in the United Kingdom. And that's an illustration of how we can have completely different understandings of terminology in different geographies, and just informing people of it can be very, very useful to prevent accidental tension, or more importantly, accidental exclusion, where, you know, someone looks at the community and says, I don't want to be part of this community, I don't feel welcome, which is probably the worst nightmare of any open source community.
Yeah, and I think these things, they kind of, let's say, until they come to the surface, they already do a lot of damage, I think.
That's such a good point. Yeah, I mean, the worst thing is if people don't even engage because they don't feel welcome, and you never know it.
Yeah, you know, I can only always see things from my personal standpoint, but for example, with the Free Software Foundation, for me, it was always like, this Stallman guy, as a woman, I really cannot identify with him, and he's just gross. And so I don't like the Free Software Foundation. So that was something like, okay, Free Software Foundation Europe, yeah, we can talk about that, but Free Software Foundation, no, it's gross, because Stallman is gross.
And that's an interesting...
Even before all these bad press came up. It was just for me as a personal viewpoint, as a woman, I said, okay, this guy, it's absolutely impossible.
And I think sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think with other things, other people also think for a long time these things are gross or they're offensive to me, and I don't feel welcome, and I don't think it's the right place for me. And maybe we should find a way to catch these things before people get offended, or that they can communicate in a maybe safer manner, not exactly on a global mailing list saying, okay, listen, can we maybe talk about this? I don't feel welcome, or that we actively try to catch these things.
And I think we touched on this as we've been feeling out in this discussion, which has been my purpose, not to simply preach to everyone, but to feel it out. As Gary brought up, as Alexander brought up, there's arguments towards hearing every side of a problem, but there's also arguments against being stuck in the politics. And ultimately, we always need to look at the core goal of the project, which isn't to solve fights, it's to solve the supply chain process management. And when it comes to something like now our new first Tuesday, because we're UTC time, our first Tuesday meeting, community figures, yes, because the other meeting, third Monday, is all geeky stuff, like digging into how processes are managed or tools are built. But when it comes to the appropriate choice of community figures and the appropriate topics, we probably need to filter to make sure we stay core mission. But we also stay very cognizant of things like, how do we maximize inclusiveness, right? So if someone, for example, a community figure has a dialogue about how the reason we don't have enough women in certain sectors of the open source community is because of these issues. Well, that's probably something we should talk about and make sure that the various projects in our community are aware of this. But on the other hand, if someone is promoting a political agenda, we probably should say, not here.
Yeah.
Yeah, a political or business, that would be the same. To come back on what you, the main topic of today, I think OpenChain is already quite diverse, and that's a good thing that you're asking yourself the questions about, how can you improve that? And the two proposal that you've made, that Jenny would talk more and that you would do organize some polls about discussions topics, are, I think, two great ideas. And the way, with polls, the good thing is that you can still manage a bit the wheel and make sure that the propositions remain aligned with the core principles of OpenChain and do not go in a direction which do not correspond to the strategy and ideology of OpenChain.
And maybe this takes us right back to the strategic advisors, where I said we probably need more. Maybe we should leverage an increased group of strategic advisors and help use them as a filter. For example, we got a bunch of proposals in for community webinars. And instead of me just going, I like this, this, and this, or something similar, we have the strategic advisors weigh in and help to decide, is this a political thing, or is this a plus for our community that helps our mission? Here's something not related to us exactly, but it was brought up by Yari in the chat. He mentioned the question, is there any whistleblower process in the open source community? Is there any need for it? Now, this isn't an OpenChain thing, obviously, but just an interesting point. I'm not sure that there is much of a support in the global open source community for people to express in private that they're concerned. Though, I'm gonna have to Google this. There is something that we're meeting. Here we go. There's a Women in Open Source Award, but there was also a series of meetings at Linux Foundation events, Women in Open Source meetings, or special lunches and so on. So I think there's a basic infrastructure for some types of diversity in the community, but maybe it's hard to find. I mean, I can't find it right now on Google, and I know they exist. So maybe as part of diversity and inclusion, OpenChain has always had one thing we didn't do, which was help tell people where to go in other parts of the communities. Like in practical terms, if you want to contribute code, where do you get started? And the answer is, for example, go to kernel.org and join the development mailing list. Maybe it would be beneficial if we also gave people places to go. For instance, if you're women in open source, if you want a kind of a group of like-minded people, have a look over here. Just a thought. But we don't want to get political there either. But again, I don't think it's politics if there's a support group for women in open source. I think that's a support group for women in open source who are a very visible minority in open source. Yeah. So if we hypothetically increase the strategic advisor group, would potentially some of you be willing to sit on it?
Yeah, generally yes, but I'm just another white face then on it.
I know what you mean. Well,
yeah, I was gonna say the same without the woman part.
Well, I mean, this conversation today is the beginning of our journey to getting better at this. So these ideas will go out to the global community, and we can explicitly push that we get a diversity of people. But I mean, if we have the idea, as always, we're not doing politics, but we're very cognizant that things like diversity and inclusion are just important for us as well as everyone else. And we want to make sure as well that people have more of a voice around our project, like the webinars, more of a voice in choosing those. So the appropriate mechanism, correct me if I'm wrong, is probably to expand the strategic advisors and perhaps to kind of do reports to the community every so often to explain the rationale and thinking over the recent activities and what's coming next. Do you think that approach would be suitable?
Yeah, I think so.
Too.
We're probably going to have to explicitly go to certain communities. For instance, go to our communities in China, India, Japan, Korea, and ask if someone local is willing to help step forward and join the strategic advisor group, because explicitly we don't have enough people from those local communities in the global community, with the potential exception for Japan, where we have people like Fukuchi-san and so on, very active in SPDX. Well, I mean, I think that's most of what we're going to do here today, which has been very useful, starting off with, there's a problem space. We want to be inclusive. Then going into what is inclusive in terms of the talks we do and what's not? Where do we draw the line? And we know the line now is no politics, but yes, inclusion and trying to learn all the time. And we know now that we probably want to expand our strategic advisors and perhaps task them with helping to steer the ship on what the First Monday webinars are, to make sure that it isn't white middle-aged male making the call on what our webinars are for strategic vision and direction. And I think that's most of it. Andrew, you just joined, so I'll give you the short version.
Oh, thanks, Shane. Sorry.
No. Okay, the short version is the development of things like the FSF action made very clear that communities in open source need to be as inclusive as possible, and that there's more to do. Now, OpenChain has done pretty well. We have a pretty inclusive community. We've got really local cultures and different races represented. But we want to talk about how we can do better. And there's a couple of points where probably we had single points of failure or not enough voice. So in our global mailing, our global work groups, there's still a bias towards essentially white males as chairs, but that's changing, and that's great. And in our choices around things like our webinars, well, we have a new format, which is First Monday is more strategic vision, community strategic vision, and Third Monday is much more nitty gritty. How does the tooling work? How do process management or IP management work? And that raises the question, how do we choose strategic vision? Okay, we know that the project doesn't want to get marred in politics. We're not a political project, we won't touch it. But when it comes to strategic vision, what's our cutoff point between this helps us understand the global trends and that's politics? And we kind of fill on the line of that anything about strategic developments around business and so on activities, totally fine. Anything about inclusion and so on, totally fine. Anything about promoting a political side outside of that, not fine. So then the question was, who chooses the webinars? And right now, me. And that's not good enough. So if we have a clear understanding of what type of webinars we have, the inflection point is probably our strategic advisors. We have 2 right now, Mattia and Katharina, but to expand that strategic advisor group, and essentially they get to have a look at the webinars and also suggest webinars and basically remove that single point of failure and also the fact that it's led simply by a white middle-aged male. So our next step will be to go to the global community, talk to the global community about expanding the strategic advisors, and get that in play for next month. And also, of course, to go to the global community and say, send us in as many ideas as you have for the first Monday, first Tuesday webinar, which the idea of strategic vision in the community. And then we'll filter out the politics. We'll keep the strategic vision that will affect our business processes or affect things like inclusion and diversity, and we schedule them. And that's the nutshell. Hope that makes sense, Andrew.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Yeah, excellent idea. Yeah, great.
What we did with this webinar is we basically mulled it through. we talked it through as opposed to someone made this decision for us. But we're done. I think I've got my action item. If anyone else has anything extra to add, let me know. If not, everyone gets 21 minutes back in their day. And thus it is, 21 minutes back in your day. If you're part of one of our local communities in areas like China, please expect me to come along and look for strategic advisors. If you're part of one of our other communities, your assistance is most welcome, along with your suggestions for strategic talks around open source. Thank you one and all, and have a lovely day.
Thank you, bye.
Yeah, thank you.
Take care.
Shane.
Okay, bye all.
Thank you.